We had a shot where Thunderbird 2 had to take off, and we used 4 rockets out of the stores that had actually been there some time, unused, and we wired them up with the detonators, the little match heads, fuses. And when they went off, because the gunpowder had cracked slightly, each of the rockets went off like one big bang, and it lifted the Thunderbird 2 off the ground. So I was up on the top of the stand, and the wires suddenly went very limp, and there was the Thunderbird 2 about 3 feet off the ground, still moving upwards slightly, and I managed to lift my arm high enough to take the weight of the Thunderbird 2 to avoid it falling off the wires and smashing on the ground. So I was actually quite pleased about that. I thought I was being very clever. I got into the special effects world because I knew a man called Les Bowie, and I was working in cement and concrete research, building 5-inch blocks of concrete and smashing them. This was way back in the mists of time, 1957. And I was driving myself mad doing this because that's all I did all day long, every day. And I was in a pub and Les came in and he said, "You look upset, miserable." And I said, "I am. Dreadful job." He said, "Do you want to sweep the floor in a film studio?" I said, "I'll take it right now like a shot." And the next week I started at Anglo-Scottish Pictures, and Les was doing matte paintings for Anglo-Scottish Pictures. Derek Meddings was one of his assistants. Ray Capel was the other one. But I worked for Anglo-Scottish Pictures and not for Les, and then learned how to load cameras with film without scratching the emulsion too much. And then I went out on documentaries for Anglo-Scottish using Newman Sinclair's clockwork cameras on location around Scotland and Wales. And then I got fired because the director said I'd spent all his money, which was untrue, but there you go. And I wound up in London at Lintas doing commercials. And then I went in the Air Force. And when I came out, Les was doing The Day the Earth Caught Fire, and I worked on that. And that was my first real effects picture. And then I was offered a job by Derek on a really early Gerry Anderson production, which was Supercar, designed by Reg Hill, I think. The pay was minimal, really minimal, but it was good fun. The pressure to get stuff done was enormous. There was never enough money in the budget, of course, but that's understandable. That's how you have to do these things, I think. Reg Hill was very fixed in his ways about certain things with regard to special effects, and Derek and I used to have a few battles with Reg. I mean, he's a charming man and everything, and a really talented storyboard artist. When it came to effects production and stuff, he had ideas that didn't really gel with Derek and I too much. And in the end, we just went on our own way anyway. Without Derek Meddings, I don't think Gerry Anderson's AP Films would have existed for very long, because it was basically Derek's designs, and then later with Mike Trim. But Derek was the major influence right from the word go, from when he started anyway. Great designs, and he didn't get a penny for them, not one single penny. That was all swallowed by the management. The opening sequence for Fireball XL Fire, where it gets fired up a ramp with all these rockets, was a nightmare because the ramp was curved for a start off. It didn't actually go in a straight line. And the fireball had to be held on wires. And there I was hanging over the top of the set, trying to match the speed of the vehicle being pulled up the thing with the rockets firing, with the curvature of the thing. And if you look at it, it's terribly bumpy, but I think that was about probably the 11th or 12th take we had on that. Fireball XL5, we had smoke problems because the sets were in a very small stage, and so everything was crammed in, and so there wasn't room for the smoke to dissipate. When we were at Ipswich Road, the roof was very close to where I was hanging on a rope, standing on scaffold boards suspended out over the set, and there was virtually no ventilation, so with all the lights on, the temperature used to get up to around 130 degrees. But I was young and I wasn't overweight then, so I managed it. And it was just a question of swinging the aircraft around as smoothly as possible, or the models around as smoothly as possible, shooting at high speed, and relying on the operator to say, yes, it came into the right height and went out at the right height. And then waiting next day for dailies before we could actually see what we'd shot. Unlike digital now, where you can just look at it as you do it. If we did go back and reshoot anything, it was because of the wires showing up. The wires that suspend the models. We had to spray them with anti-flare, the wires. We had the tungsten wires were actually, we had blackened versions of the tungsten wires, which helped. But then you'd still have to anti-flare them, and then you had to puff various colored powders on to match the tone of the background, whether it was blue sky or white or whatever else it was. And sometimes you just didn't see that as it went through the frame, it reflected one of the lights. We would have to reshoot those, otherwise we got away with it. Except with the high definition version now, you can see the wires quite plainly. Whereas with 405 line television, we got away with murder. So I think we shot that in black and white. So we were used to reasonably high speed film. And then when we moved on, suddenly Gerry decided that despite the fact there was only black and white television in England, he'd been to America and seen all the color stuff and knew that that's the way things were going. And so we were then onto colour film with virtually no f-stop available to shoot high speed because we needed so many lights. The temperature in on the stages used to get so hot because we would have 4 or 5 10Ks burning away. And we had to be careful because if we had water splashing around, that sometimes used to blow the Fresnels off the 10Ks and glass would cascade everywhere. So we had quite an exciting time really, apart from the explosions we were doing. The surface water tank we used was about 2.5 feet deep, but the actual water that we had was pumped in and recirculated. The water used to go over the horizon, so we had a clear horizon, and then that was recirculated while we were shooting. Then we had little wind machines on either side to make the waves, and somebody wafting them with a bit of wood to give the impression of waves. When the stingray and the mechanical fish come out of the water, that was Derek and I hanging up in the roof of the stage doing that. It took quite a bit of time to do. And we had to repeat it a number of times before we got it right. We were literally lifting the models out of the water and then back down into the water again. The stingray was made of balsa wood and filled, so it began to swell and crack. And mechanical fish didn't matter because it was all sort of rough, but we had to keep sending it back to the model makers to be dried out and refurbished. The problems on Stingray with water is that you can't actually stick the models in water and film them. It's just madness to do that. So we had these fish tanks that we used to stick in front of the camera, and then behind that we would build the set, hang the models on wires, and then waft a little smoke in or whatever to make it look like mist and stuff. And we had fish in the fish tank to give it a bit of believability, and that's how we solved the problem of shooting underwater when we couldn't shoot underwater. And it meant we could change the sets very quickly as well, which wouldn't have happened if we'd had a tank. We'd been inside the tank. It would have been a nightmare. When Stingray came out of the tunnel, that was actually a glass shot. We had a glass in the foreground to cover up the top half of the thing, and then we did the action, avoiding the painting on the glass that was in the foreground. That's when we had to have a big depth of field there. Water and fire are considered not to be easy to work with, simply because of the scale involved. Water droplets give the game away. Even on a major feature film, you can even look on a Bond and sometimes you can see water droplets showing up that tell you that that was a model and not reality. And the same with fire, the little flames that lick around. The smaller you can make those flames, the bigger the scale of the fire. If it's big, huge amounts of flame, that always gives the game away as well. So we're always fighting those things. Sometimes we'd actually spray water on the flames just to make them break up a bit. The higher speed the camera that we could get, the better the effects looked. The greater depth of field we had, the better it looked. And to that extent, we had lots of very bright lights, which made the atmosphere very hot. But it helped with the end result. When we were filming in those days, when we were filming models, they weren't very large models. To make them look realistic, we used really wide-angle lenses, the widest we could get at the time. And then to get the maximum depth of field that we could get, so everything was sharp. And then the models would be actually passing quite close to the camera. And that gave us the sort of perspective thing that we needed. The numbers, all the things like that were all letraset, and so we didn't always have the same font available. And sometimes you get a sheet of letraset would actually cost quite a bit of money. You'd only use about 3 symbols from it, or 4 symbols. So yeah, sometimes we did have a problem. It didn't bother us too much. Derek and I were determined that we would just try and make everything better as we went along, and I think on Thunderbirds, we got it about as good as we could get for the scale that was being used. And so that was the most satisfying thing, was seeing that on the screen and then hearing reactions from other people saying, oh, that's pretty good. The thing was, we had to do about 5 shots a day, I think. And so if we did have a problem with the models, if we had one in reserve, then we would wire that up. But if it was badly damaged, then that was a major, and we might have to go and build another set. And the model might have to go back to Aeronautical General Modelers or Space Models, whoever it was that was making them, to be refurbished. And if you look at the Thunderbird 2, there's about 6 different color greens, because they were modified quite considerably through crashing and burning and everything else. The rocket motors were steel tubes with a clay base, really hard dried clay base, with gunpowder pressed in at 10 tons to the square inch to make the gunpowder absolutely solid, so that when you lit it at the top with a match head fuse, it burnt from the top down to the bottom, producing flame and a bit of smoke. If the tubes were older, which we discovered later, having got some of them out of the store, they sometimes would ignite virtually at both ends at the same time. Huge explosion, and produced a thrust enough to lift the Thunderbird 2 off the ground without me lifting it up on the wires. So that caused a few moments of excitement. So what we did in the end was we ordered a fewer number of rockets over a shorter period of time to stop them from age hardening, as it were. Well, management were telling us that we couldn't afford to spend money on the sets and things, but we had to spend some money, and the management side seemed to be more intent on saving money than worrying about the production as such. So we did the best we could with what we had available. But we always ran into this block about, oh, you can't have this, you can't have that, it's too expensive. And yet sometimes what we wanted might have been expensive to start with, but it meant that we saved time in the actual production, and therefore we saved money. So they weren't looking in the right direction. There was huge rivalry between the puppeteers and the effects stages. A, because we made lots of smoke which would drift through into their stage, and the puppeteers were all up in the roof on their sets. And the girls didn't like any of the explosions, because sometimes there were lots of explosions. We always warned them, but the bangs were invariably louder than they were expecting. And, you know, we used to tease them and they'd tease us about puppets and strings and, you know, when are we going to get real people on this show and that sort of stuff, you know. Yeah, there was rivalry, but it was friendly rivalry. Because Thunderbirds was quite a popular show, we had a visit from Patrick Moore one day, who turned up, and he was absolutely delightful, and came round and was very knowledgeable about things and thoroughly enjoyed the show. As an astronomer, I think. Of course, we had Barry Gray visiting quite often, who wrote the music. And Barry, because of performing rights and everything, was making large sums of money. So every time he turned up in a new Lamborghini or a new Ferrari or something like that. Because lots of kids wrote in, of course. And that was handled by the publicity, which was Keith Shackleton and his assistant. And so we'd see these letters and wonderful drawings. In fact, I think Derek had some of the drawings of Thunderbird 2 drawn by kids of 3 or 4 years of age stuck in his office. I seem to remember, I can't remember whether that was his kids or other kids, but there were always some around somewhere. Gerry brought vision to the production in that he could see the big picture, and he could see selling stuff to America was probably much more important than anything else, because the audience was so huge compared with And then the residuals that were involved in that, when they did all the repeats and everything else, he knew that that's where they would make the money. So he was very good at that. What he wasn't very good at was taking into account that he had a crew of people that needed to be encouraged rather than browbeaten. He didn't really encourage Derek very much, which I was surprised at, really. Sylvia was a goddess, without doubt the most important part of AP Films, I think. She was the person everybody went to if there was ever a problem, and she sorted them out. And I think a lot of people would have left had Sylvia not actually been working there. Sylvia smoothed things over and was no fool when it came to actually deciding what could and couldn't be done with the shots. She was amazing on the production side. And she and Gerry were a team, but they gradually sort of grew apart, and I think their whole concept of things changed as the years went on. And then eventually, of course, they got divorced as well, so that was the end of that. But Sylvia went on to HBO and organised some fantastic productions and things. My least favourite effect shots were anything to do with animals that were involved in the shot. I didn't want to get involved with prodding animals around too much. There was an episode on Thunderbirds using live alligators that came quite close to the end of production, and I fortunately had already left by then, but there was one shot that I did see where they were being moved, and you could tell they were being moved by being shocked with little electric wires and things, which I didn't agree with. That was one of the reasons why I decided I was going to move on to work for Stanley Kubrick on 2001. I left AP Films because years before, Derek and I had always talked about if the opportunity came up to work on a feature film rather than puppets, either or both of us would go, if we could. In those days, the union required 1 week's notice to leave, and I gave AP Films a month's notice. And on the 2 days before I was due to leave, I was called into Gerry's office. And when I got in there was the entire board of AP Films there. Gerry had a huge cigar, which he'd been given by Lou Grade. And most of the board of AP Films, that was John Reed and Sylvia and everybody else, were looking very uncomfortable and not looking at me, looking at the ground. And Gerry said, I've been to see Lou Grade, and he says I can pay you 3 times the amount you're getting at the moment. And I said, but Gerry, I gave you my notice a month ago, or nearly a month ago, which was 4 times the actual required amount, and I'm going to go and work on 2001, which is a feature film. And he said, is that your final word? And I said, yes. And he got hold of this huge Churchillian cigar, Lou Grade cigar, and he stubbed it into his desk, and it shattered into 1,000 pieces and sparks went everywhere. And he said, you'll never work in the film industry again. I worked again for Gerry on a number of different productions. What Gerry said at that thing was because he was annoyed that I faced up to him and decided I was going to go. But by the same token, I was actually quite good at my job, and there weren't other people around were doing other things, and so I got offered other jobs, and particularly on Space 1999. And that's because Derek had gone on to do Superman or the Bonds or something like that. We made up, like you do when you need money to pay for your mortgage and children's fees and all the other things. My feelings about working on those series were that I was glad I did it, but by the same token, I was really hungry to get away and work on feature films. Well, they're pretty good scripts, and there's plenty of action, and they just got a niche that appealed to a lot of children and adults too. And I think Gerry and Sylvia should be congratulated for that. And we had a good team of people, so every day was good fun to go and work. I'm proud of what I did on Thunderbirds and all the other things. Yep, definitely.